The Half-Life series has been going on for nearly 30 years now. Well, not really going on, but anyways. And even after all this time, there is a very strong community surrounding it, infatuated by its lore, and still praying that Valve finally gets up and actually finishes the series. While I played Half-Life 2 growing up, my main exposure to the game was through Gary's mod. And the main thing I used to do in that game was set up little scenes with various props, either from the default spawn menu or add-ons in the workshop. Also, a quick fun fact about me playing the Half-Life series. When I first picked up Half-Life 2 Episode 2, I was aware of the gnome achievement, but all I had heard is that you needed to take the gnome to the end of the game. I didn't even know the name of the achievement, so after doing no research, instead of leaving the gnome in the rocket so I could actually get it, I instead brought the gnome all the way to the end of the game. And I don't know if Half-Life fans think this is stupid or impressive. Probably both. But anyways. And one thing about Half-Life 2 that I fell in love with, specifically after downloading pre-war Half-Life 2 vehicles by Rusty and Renafox, were the various cars that Valve added to Half-Life 2. In fact, the very first YouTube channel that I made in 2015 was originally called Moscovich64, and it was also the first name that I ever released music under, so here's that, I guess. Now let's hear the music I make now.
£1,000 of C4 in the Starbucks coffee store. You're going to be
I actually had the idea for this video all the way back in 2018, where I kind of started working on it but gave up soon after. So now, after 7 years of limbo, here are the cars of the Half-Life series. To start off, I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about any of the fictional or drivable vehicles in the Half-Life series. In this video, I'll only be talking about the various non-player vehicles found across the worlds from Half-Life to Half-Life Alyx, along with the beta for Half-Life 2. And the cars I won't be mentioning today can be a topic for another video. First, I have to talk about the cars from Half-Life 1.
Speaking.
But it's going to be brief because, for one, I find them overall uninteresting, and two, there just aren't many in the game. There are only 2 civilian cars in Half-Life 1, both just being generic SUVs, loosely based off of American cars from the 1980s and 90s. And the wiki gives the 1994 Toyota 4Runner or the 1980 Nissan Pathfinder as potential references for these models in-game. Now with Half-Life 1 out of the way, we need to move on to Half-Life 2, where things really start to get interesting. The Trabant 601 is an East German car that was produced from 1964 to 1990, and it is often regarded as one of the worst cars in existence. There are many problems with this car, one of the major ones being its 2-stroke engine. You had to mix the gas with the oil every time you wanted to refill it. Because East Germany was a poor communist country, they didn't really have the funds for decent manufacturing and materials. So the body of the car itself is made of a weird plastic material called duoplex, which means it can't be crushed down in a junkyard or sold for scrap. In fact, you actually have to pay someone to take it in to properly dispose of it. And the worst part of all this is that this was one of the only 2 options you'd have for a car in East Germany. And this wasn't like the United States, or really any other country for that matter, where you could just go to a car dealership and buy the car with cash or card. You had to fill out a form to put you on a list to get one, and actually obtaining one could take you years. And this was the same case in Soviet Russia, but at least there they had more than just 2 manufacturers to choose from. The first 2 Trabants, the Trabant 500 and the Trabant 600, were both produced in the late 1950s. And while the body more or less looks the same, the front is significantly different. And in 1964, they would unveil the car that East German citizens would have to look at on their roads for the next 26 years. the Trabant 601. There are a number of variants, but the ones that appear in Half-Life 2 are the Trabant 601 Family Edition. There were 2 Trabant models found in the leak for Half-Life 2. Both of them look the same, but one of them is rigged, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The main differences between the final version and these earlier versions is one, for some reason they're slightly smaller. The texture is slightly lighter, and their interiors are clean. Practically every Trabant post-1964 looks more or less the same, only really slightly changing the look of the grille. And side note, they totally stole this look from a number of British cars from the late 1950s. Regardless of the Trabant being regarded as one of the worst cars in history, it has a cult fan base with hundreds of thousands of fans, and there are many events themed after these strange little cars. The Volkswagen Golf MK2 is a hatchback that was produced from 1983 to 1992 in Germany and from 1985 to 1992 in Yugoslavia. There are a few models in game, and 2 of them have an interesting quirk, in that they are both fully rigged, and there are a small number of paint jobs, but some are not seen in the final game. The rigged models stand out as they are the only cars that are rigged, and the fact that a cut version of the Trabant, which was fully rigged, was found in the leaks, along with the Avia, may suggest that at some point all of the wrecks were meant to be fully rigged, but this decision was cut either for performance issues or because of a deadline. The wide range of colors, along with the E3 presentation only showing these Golfs, tells me that later in development, these cars were heavily used as placeholders before they made the rest of the car models. The Alyx Skoda 706 RT is another Czech vehicle that was produced from 1957 to 1990. There is only one model in-game, and pre-war they were used to transport petrol, and their role in-game is for the most part to be obstacles for the player. The Moskvich 2140 is another Soviet-Russian car, produced from 1976 to 1988, and manufactured by AZLK. And while it's definitely in worse shape than the white Trabant, it's not in terrible condition. Speaking of vehicles that are not in terrible condition, the ZAZ 968 is another small family car that was produced by ZAZ, a Soviet-Ukrainian car manufacturer from 1971 to 1980, and apparently Putin has driven one. When compared to its real-life variant, the only mistake that Valve made when recreating this car is that they didn't add the chutes in the back that would collect air to cool the engine, instead using flat vents like the ones on the ZAZ 968M. It's clearly not a 968M, however, since the front is undeniably from a original 968. My theory is that because the vents on the actual 968 are curvy, Valve chose not to add them, and they used the flat vents instead to save on resources. Otherwise, it's a pretty accurate recreation, and in my opinion, one of the best looking cars in the game. There is a second variant of this model present with white paint that is much more heavily damaged, with the bumper being dislocated and a large portion of the roof caved in. The Volga Gaz-24 was a Soviet Union car that was produced from 1970 to 1985. Pre-war, the Volga appears to have been very popular in Ravenholm, as many can be found parked around the city, as well as being used for makeshift traps. You may remember that at one point in the chapter, there's one parked next to a collection of explosive barrels that you can shoot and blow the vehicle to the adjacent wall, leaving a trail of fire. This is the official release version of what we saw at the end of the E3 presentation for Half-Life 2, although the presentation used the Golf instead of the Volga. And just like the ZAZ in Moskvich, there is a second model with much heavier damage. The Gaz-53 was a large truck which was produced by Gaz, which stood for Gorky Automotive Plant. Fucking Gorky. In both Russia and Bulgaria from 1961 to 1993. Although the production in Bulgaria started a few years later in 1967. In the real world, the 53 was used for a number of utilities and was very common across Eastern Europe, even sometimes being converted into vans. And the one model of it we see in-game is a tow truck. The RAV 2203 is what's referred to as a cab-over van, and was produced from 1976 to 1997. They were commonly used as medical vehicles and as taxis. The in-game model is heavily damaged, with many bullet holes across the body and a lambda symbol on the back right-hand side. This model comes in blue and white, but there is also a separate model painted dark orange, and while it doesn't have any bullet holes, it is significantly more damaged. And Gordon and Alyx use it to travel into the Citadel in the beginning of Half-Life 2 Episode 1. The lambda symbol on the car, along with the bullet holes, tells me that at one point, these vans were likely once used by Resistance members who were unfortunately tracked down. The Avia A31 is a large truck from the Czech Republic and started production in 1983. They can be found in green or blue, and the Avia symbol in the front has been replaced with PAC, which is much easier to read on the uncompressed texture found in the beta. The third and final fully rigged car found in the beta, it has fully inflated wheels, but unfortunately they do not spin. So that was a huge missed opportunity. Now we are going to take a very dark and gritty look into the cut cars and trucks from the Half-Life 2 beta. The Resistance truck is a unique case in that I'm not exactly sure what it's based on, but it has some resemblance to some larger trucks from the 1970s. Even though the body is rusted and the windshields are heavily damaged and dirty, their tires are fully inflated, and they were what the Resistance used to transport troops. Now, a lot of the cars in the beta look a bit janky and like they wouldn't quite fit in the finished game. But this next one is just straight up unfinished. Based on a Ford Angula from the 1960s, only the basic shape and the basic form of the front is complete, with the back appearing to be completely unfinished. There is a Austin Mini Cooper available in the files, and just like the Trabant, they didn't really change much in design over the years, so it's hard to speculate which exact year this model was based on. There are a few variants in paint jobs, which vary in condition. Funnily enough, in the beta, not just one, but two trucks were cut from the game. The first is this low-poly 1979 Ford F-350, and the second is a wrecked, rusted-out piece of junk that loosely resembles a Ford Model T truck from either the late 1910s or early 1920s. If this had made its way into the game, it would have easily been the oldest car ever to feature in the Half-Life series. And I don't know, there's just something about this thing that I really like. I'm sure the fact that I love 1920s cars does not influence my opinion whatsoever. Unlike the base game, the majority of the cut vehicles are typical American cars from the late 1970s and early 80s. We can see a 1978 GMC Vendura, a 1981 Chevrolet Caprice sedan, and the aforementioned 1979 Ford F-350. And all of these were scrapped once the setting was shifted to a vaguely European country. The Vaz 2103 was manufactured in Russia by Vaz from 1972 to 1984, and interestingly, it is the only Eastern European car found in the beta.
It's unloaded now!
Finally, I'm going to talk about the cars of Half-Life Alyx. And honestly, I didn't know that there were this many new cars in Half-Life Alyx, so I'm just going to quickly speed through them. The Trabant, Golf, Avia, Moskvich, Liaz, and Raf all make reappearances. There's a Gaz-24 Volga and Gaz-24 Volga Riga, okay, both from 1972. A Zastava 101, which were made in Yugoslavia and Serbia, and the Lada Niva, made by Otto Vaz, which was formerly Vaz, a name that we saw earlier in this video. Besides just being set pieces, the doors on the RAF can be opened and used as cover in-game. And those are all the non-player civilian trucks and cars from the Half-Life series. Before I end the video, I want to talk about something that came to me while I was in the process of doing research, and it's the lore implications having these cars in the games, specifically after Half-Life 2 has. If this game is supposed to take place in Eastern Europe, it makes no sense for the Trabant to be so present in-game. While East Germany was obviously a communist state, I'm pretty certain that they never exported any of their Trabants out to any other countries. And I doubt that they really would have wanted them anyways, because although most Soviet cars were pretty bad, even for the standards of the time, they were for sure a lot better than the Trabant. The second thing that's confusing about these cars is how old they are. Now, in post-Soviet states, there definitely were a lot of people still driving these cars on the roads, either out of poverty or necessity. But the 7-Hour War most likely took place between 2000 and 2003, nearly 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And by then, there were a number of newer cars that were coming into the market, and it makes the pre-war of Half-Life 2 appear like it had been in a limbo since 1991. Just the addition of one newer Eastern European car would have alleviated this discrepancy, something like the Lada 110, or really anything from Vaz from the decade. Also, while looking at photos for the Trabant, I saw in the background a Volkswagen Golf, and it's made me come to the conclusion that the fact that the Trabant and the Golf were present in the beta, along with the setting in the Half-Life presentation at E3, leads me to believe early in development, after the setting was shifted away from the United States, it's possible that they were planning for Half-Life 2 to take place in former East Germany. Thank you for watching my gay little video, as you were probably jerking off or playing Fortnite. Subscribe to the Mr. Epic on YouTube.com, and always remember,
Prepare for unforeseen consequences.
Hey, eat this, you bastard!